Welcome to this YSL DAX for Power BI tutorial. In this part of the series we're going to cover the sum, SumX and a range of other aggregate functions. We'll start with a quick overview of the basic aggregate functions such as sum, average, min and max, then explain why those functions don't work when you nest a calculation inside them. We'll show you a solution to that using the SumX and a range of other AggregateX functions. We'll explain how you can nest functions in your aggregate functions, and then finally at the end of the video how you can reference columns in other tables within your AggregateX functions. So let's get started. To get started, I've created a new blank report, and as usual the first thing I'll do is import some data from an Excel workbook. I'll drop a link in the video description so you can download this file yourself, and it's just a slightly modified version of the movies file we've been working with in the previous few videos. One change I've made here is to include an empty all measures table, just to avoid having to create this ourselves once we've finished importing the data. So it's got a single column called delete this column, which we will do shortly, but for now I'm just going to select the all measures table, hold down the shift key and select the genre table, and then click the load button to import everything into the data model. Now that that's finished, we can have a quick look in the model view just to see how the tables are related. So you can see it's a slightly simplified version of the movies model we've worked with in previous videos. There aren't quite as many dimension tables in this video, we didn't need them. We've got this extra all measures table, which is empty apart from a column that we'll delete shortly. One thing I'd like to do just to tidy things up when we're working in the report view is to hide any ID columns. So from the fields list at the right hand side, I'm going to type in ID in the top search box, then select each of the individual ID columns except for film ID, and then choose to hide all of those so they don't clutter up the field list when we're building our visualizations. Now that we've done that, we can head back to the report view, and then we're ready to start creating our first basic measures. For the first few basic measures we'll create in this video, we're going to use a set of functions that you're probably already familiar with from other Microsoft products. I'd like to calculate the sum, average, min and max of the runtime minutes field from the film table. So to do that, we'll start with the sum function. I'm going to select the all measures table and choose to create a new measure. Then when the formula bar appears, I'll just zoom in a little so you can see this more clearly. And I'll call this first measure total run time. I'll make this equal to the result of the sum function, and you'll see that when the tooltip appears, the sum function in DAX requires a reference to a single column name. So I'm going to refer to the runtime minutes field from the film table, close the round brackets and then hit enter to create that first measure. I can then copy and paste this measure. It's pointless creating the entire thing again from scratch, so let's copy and paste it into a new measure, and then we'll use this one to calculate the average runtime. So I'll change the function name or the measure name to say average, and then I'll also change the sum function to the average function. Again, if I just reopen the round brackets there, you can hopefully see the average function also requires a reference to a single column name. I'll then create another new measure, and we'll paste in again the code I've just copied, and I'll change this to say longest runtime, and to do this we'll use the max function. And the max function is a little different to sum and average because it has two parameters as an optional second parameter, so I could pass in either two simple numbers and get the biggest of those two, or I can pass in a reference to a single column name. So we'll use max in the same way we've used sum and average. Finally, let's create one for the shortest runtime, so we'll create one more new measure, and we'll call this one shortest runtime, and we'll use the min function to do that. Now that we've got some measures in our all measures table, we can finally delete the delete this column. So let's right click on that and choose to remove it. And then finally, we could create a visualization to display the results of these measures. I'm just going to add a basic table into the report, and then I'll just collapse the filters panel so I've got a bit more space to display the results of this table. And then let's include the total runtime, the average runtime, the longest and the shortest. A tiny bit of basic formatting as well. If I head to the format panel in the visualizations pane and then go for the values card. Let's just increase the font size a little bit to make this a little easier to read. So there we go, these are the grand totals, averages, longest and shortest for all the films in the film table. But don't forget, of course, that measures respond to the context in which they sit. So if we head back to the data pane, or the field well of the visualizations panel, we could add in a field to break this data up into multiple categories. So I'm going to drag the genre field from the genre table into the first column of our visual, and that will calculate the total, the average, longest and shortest runtimes for each individual genre in the dataset. Now, even if you know only the absolute basics of working in Power BI Desktop, you probably realize that we didn't need to create these measures to display this set of results. If we wanted to, we could have easily just dragged the runtime minutes field into the table visual, and that by default will provide us with a sum of runtime minutes, so the answers here will be identical to those generated by our measure. The reason we get a sum of runtime is because that's the default aggregate function applied to that field. If we select the runtime minutes field in the fields list, you can change the default summarization option using this drop-down list here. If you wanted to display multiple aggregations of the same field in the same visual, that's no problem either. We can drag the runtime minutes field into this table as often as we like, and then use the drop-down arrow to the right-hand side to alter the aggregate function that's applied to that specific column. So we can add an average, and a maximum, and a minimum in the same table. Now, even though we didn't need to create our measures then to generate this set of results, the measures can be quite helpful, particularly if you wanted to use these same aggregations in multiple visuals throughout the report. If we didn't have the measures, we'd have to go through this tedious process of changing the aggregation each time we add a field to a visual. Whereas with a measure, these are predefined to always generate the average, sum, min and max. Another slightly smaller advantage is that our measures have sensible names that we created at the point we generated the measure. Whereas with these basic aggregations from the field that we've added to the table, although we can change them manually, it's tedious again to have to do that each time we add the field to the table. So even though it's a bit more long-winded to create the measures in the first place, in the long run it can save you time. For the next example, I'd like to try to do something a bit more complicated. I want to work out the total profit by subtracting the budget from the box office dollars. Let's try to do that first of all using a basic measure using the sum function. So I'll right-click my All Measures table and choose New Measure, and I'll call this new measure Total Profit. I'll make this equal to the result of the sum function. Now, just a quick little reminder that the sum function requires a reference to a column name. So I'm going to start by referring to the box office dollars column. And then I'd like to try to subtract from that the budget dollars. And almost immediately things start to go wrong. You can see from the red squiggly underline here. I also don't get much help with my IntelliSense. If I try to refer to the film budget dollars, nothing appears in the IntelliSense. I can, of course, persist and just carry on typing in the column name. But that doesn't help with the red squiggly. Things are still going wrong. If I hover the mouse cursor over that, it tells me that the parameter is not the correct type. So you remember that the sum function wants and expects a reference to a single column name. And here we've tried to enter an expression or a calculation, and the sum function simply can't accept that. So let's just abandon this for the moment. I'm going to click the cross here or press Escape to abandon that calculation. One option we have to solve this problem would be to create a calculated column in the film table which subtracts the budget from the box office for each individual film. Then we could reference that single column in the sum function in a new measure. Let's just demonstrate how that would work. If I head into the data view, it's not necessary to go to the data view to do this, but it helps to see the end results. I'm then going to select the film table on the right hand side, and then I'm going to create a new column in this table. I'll just zoom in the formula bar so we can see what's going on. And I'll call this one Profit and make it equal to the box office dollars column minus the budget dollars column. When I press enter, you'll see that Power BI will then automatically apply that expression to each individual row in the film table. So you get a separate result for each individual row stored in the data model. Now that I've created that column, I could then head into the report view, and again, this is just so we can see the results more easily, and then I can add a new measure to the all measures table, and I'll call this one total profit, and simply make this one equal to the sum of the film profit column. And because that is now a reference to just a single column name, when I close the round brackets and hit enter, that will, if I add it to the table, display the total profit for all the films. But what if you didn't want to create this calculated column which occupies more space in your data model? Well, there is a solution to that, and to see how it works, let's go back and select our total profit measure. And then in the formula bar, we'll modify the function that we're using. We're not going to use the sum function, we're going to use a function called SumX. What the SumX function does is it evaluates an expression or a calculation for each row in a table and then provides the total of that expression. So it's basically what we've done here by creating the calculated column and then applying a sum to it, all done in one single function without the need to create the intermediate calculated column. So there are two parameters, there's a table parameter and an expression parameter. The table is the one that you want to calculate this expression on each row of. So I'm going to just hit Shift and Enter to throw a new line, and I want to calculate an expression for each row of the film table. You'll hear this type of thing referred to as an iterator in some of the documentation for DAX. So iterating simply means looking at each individual row of a table and doing the same thing for each row. So that's what we're going to do here. We're going to calculate for each row of the film table the box office dollars minus the budget dollars. So it's the exact same expression we wrote in our calculated column. If I can then close a set of round brackets and hit enter, we'll see the end result of that column is identical to what it was before. But now we can get rid of the extra profit column. We no longer need that. So I can right click on the profit column and choose to delete that from the model. Confirm that I want to do that. It's no longer necessary because all of that calculating is done inside the measure itself. All of the other basic aggregate functions we've used so far have an X version which allows you to calculate that aggregate for an expression. So let's say, for example, we wanted to calculate the average profit. It's probably no great surprise that there's a function called AverageX. So if I just copy the SumX function and then create another new measure, paste in all of that code, we can just change the name of the measure to average profit and then use the AggregateX function to calculate the average of the result of subtracting the budget from the box office for each row of the film table. We can then add that measure into our table visual, and it may be worthwhile just adding a quick basic format to that to make it look a little more readable. Let's apply the English United States currency format to that. We'll do the same thing for the total profit just for consistency there as well. Okay, so having done that, there we go, a couple of measures using an AggregateX function. To demonstrate the MaxX and MinX functions, let's do something a little more complicated than just this basic arithmetic. I want to work out the highest and the lowest profit margin for our films. And to do that, we'll need to subtract the budget from the box office and then divide the result of that by the box office. We do that for each individual row of the film table and then return either the largest or the smallest value in that set of results. So we can once again copy and paste the total profit measure just as a starting point and then create another new measure in the all measures table. Paste that in, and then let's change the name of this. Let's call this one largest profit margin or biggest profit margin or highest profit margin, something along those lines. We're not going to use the SumX function, we'll use the MaxX function. Again, the parameter list is the same, so you say which table you're iterating through the rows of, and then the expression you'd like to evaluate for each row of that table. So I'm going to use the divide function to perform a safe divide. You may remember that from previous videos. So this is basically just to show you that you can nest functions inside your AggregateX functions, just like for any other expression. So divide film box office dollars minus budget dollars, and we'll divide that by the box office dollars. We can then close the round brackets for the divide function and that's that expression created. Things can get way more complicated than this. This is still a fairly basic example, mainly just to show you can nest functions inside AggregateX functions. While I'm here, I'm going to copy that expression and then update my measure. There's the largest profit margin. Let's create another new measure, paste this in, and we'll call this one smallest profit margin. And then use the MinX function, or the MinX function, I suppose, if you prefer. And the end result, the expression we'll evaluate is the same. Let's just apply a bit of basic formatting to these measures as well. So we'll apply the percentage formatting to both smallest profit margin and largest profit margin. And then we can add those fields or those measures into our table visual to see the end results. And there we go. For the final example, I just wanted to demonstrate that even though the AggregateX functions force you to state which table you're iterating through the rows of, it doesn't prevent you from referencing values in other tables in your data model. So what I'd like to do for the final example is calculate the profit of our films based on the local currency for the country in which the film was made. So we're going to do this as a calculated column first of all. We're going to work out the profit loss by subtracting the budget from the box office, and then convert that by following this chain of relationships through the country table, through to the currency table, and referencing the exchange rate USD column. Just so you can see what data is contained in there, it was correct at the time of writing, or as close as I could get to the time of writing. So there's the exchange rates for that set of data. So if we do this as a calculated column first of all, let's head to the film table and let's add a new column. We'll call this one, let's call it profit local. Profit local, there we go. And to start with, we'll need to subtract the budget from the box office. So in some round brackets, I'm going to say box office dollars minus budget dollars, and then close that set of round brackets. What I then need to do is multiply that by a value in a related table. And you may remember from a previous video in the series, when you want to reference a column in a related table, I can't just say currency and then refer to the exchange rate. I need to use a function called related. So I can say related, currency exchange rate USD, close the round brackets, and then hit enter to calculate that result. So that will give us the profit for each film based on its local currency. Lots of US films there, of course, but if we scroll down a bit, we can see some different countries appearing in the list, so they should give different results compared to the original profit column. Let's just head back to the report view, and I'd like to tidy up this table. So I'm going to get rid of a bunch of these columns. Let's get rid of all the runtime columns. I'm going to keep the total profit and average profit though. And I want to change the way the table is grouped. So rather than grouping it by genre, I want to group it by country. So there we go. Then with that new calculated column, profit local, I'm going to drag that into the table. And you can hopefully see that apart from the United States, which should have the same result for the total profit and profit local, everything else should be slightly different because of the exchange rates. Okay, so that's doing it using a calculated column. What if we wanted to do that using a measure? Well, no big deal actually, pretty much the same sort of thing we've just been doing. Let's add a new measure, and I'm going to call this one total profit local. If I can spell that correctly eventually, there we go. And we're going to use the SumX function to iterate through the rows of the film table. The expression I'd like to calculate is to subtract from the box office dollars the budget dollars, and then I want to multiply that by the related currency exchange rate. So again, here I need to refer to the related function and then find the currency exchange rate USD column. Close a set of round brackets for the related function, and then another set of round brackets for the SumX function. And there's our final measure created. So I can enter that, and then I can add this field to, or this measure I should say, to my table visual. See that it generates exactly the same results as we got for our calculated column version. So let's get rid of the calculated column, and then we can delete that from the data model. There's no point in having it in there in the model, occupying space. So there you go, some basic information about both basic aggregate functions and AggregateX functions. Hope you found that one useful. Thanks very much for watching. See you next time.